Well, good day, and welcome to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation's event on China versus the WTO, 2 decades of dissembling and dysfunction. I'm Stephen Ezel, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy here at ITIF, and we're delighted to have you with us today. As you may know, December 11th, 2021, last Saturday, marked the 20th year anniversary of China's membership in the WTO, and we have assembled an all-star set of panelists today to discuss the status of China's first 20 years as part of that organization. As we get into the program, I'd like to remind our audience that we can take your questions via the Slido app found at the bottom of ITF's event webpage and on the YouTube channel feed. I'll make about a 15-minute presentation and turn the conversation over to our panelists, but I'll introduce them now. First today, we have with us André Sapir, who was a professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles and senior fellow at Bruegel. Previously, André taught at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and the College of Europe, and was a visiting fellow with the IMF, World Bank, and the WTO. From 1990 to 2004, André was affiliated with the European Commission, working first as economic advisor to the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs, and then as principal economic advisor to then President Romano Prodi. His most recent book, co-authored with Petros Mavroidis, is China and the WTO, Why Multilateralism Still Matters. It's an excellent book, which has been hugely helpful in my research. I encourage you all to read it. André has a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University. Next, we'll have with us Daniel Crosby, who was a partner in the international trade practice and manager of the Geneva office of the law firm King & Spalding, where he specializes in international trade, investment, and matters related to public international law. Daniel was previously a partner at Boudin & Associates and an associate at White & Case. He holds a JD in law from American University. Finally, last but not least, Clete Williams, who was a partner at Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer & where he advises clients on international economic law and policy matters. Clete previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics and Deputy NEC Director in the Trump administration. And before that, he was Chief Counsel for Negotiations at the United States Trade Representative's Office. Clete holds a JD in law from Georgetown University. Thank you all for being with us today. So in July of this year, ITIF released a new report called False Promises 2, the yawning gap between China's WTO commitments and practices. This report was a follow-on to a 2016 report we'd written upon China's first 15 years in the WTO. And as you might expect, our 20th year anniversary report finds actually that not much has changed with regards to China's, in many cases, failure to comply with its WTO commitments. Cindy, if we could have the slides, please. Next slide. So in my presentation today, I wanted to cover 3 topics with you. First, U.S.-China trade and economic challenges. Secondly, how China continues to fall short of its WTO commitments. And third, policy recommendations. Next slide, please. Now, in the report, we argue that modern Chinese economic policy has evolved through roughly 3 phases. The first, from 1980 to 2006, was characterized largely by FDI attraction, trying to attract globally mobile manufacturing activities to China as a starting point for industrial development. Phase 2, from 2006 to 2012, we characterize as a period of kind of indigenous innovation, largely characterized by China's national medium and long-term program for science and technology development, which identified 402 key technologies which China sought mastery over. The idea was really to help Chinese companies move up the value chain and acquire more proficiency in advanced technology industries. But phase 3, roughly contemporaneous with the arrival of current Chinese President Xi Jinping, we call China Inc. And this is really a phase that is characterized by intent to kind of capture the commanding heights of the global economy across a wide range of advanced technology industries, everything from AI and advanced manufacturing to biotechnology and high-speed rail. It's characterized by programs like the Made in China 2025 strategy, the 13th Five-Year Plan for Science and Technology. But as Nick Lardy of the Peterson Institute for International Economics writes, what we really have in this phase is a period where quote, market-driven growth has made way for a resurgence of the state in resource allocation and a shrinking role for the market and private firms. Next slide, please. So we believe that China is truly unique in the global trading system. Its economy and trade policy is characterized by a heavily mercantilist strategy. The country, in our view, seeks autarky and absolute advantage. What that means is that China doesn't accept the traditional global trade approach of comparative advantage, where some countries specialize in products like wine or textiles and trade for others. No, China seeks absolute advantage across a range of high technology industries. It wants to dominate in aircraft, in biotechnology, in solar panels, etc. In China, the state and market are fundamentally joined at the hip. Policies intentionally favor Chinese firms to the detriment or disadvantage of foreign enterprises. And fundamentally, there is a lack of rule of law in China. That's because the will of the party, the will of the CCP will always prevail. There is law in China, intellectual property law has improved, but at the end of the day, the will of the party will prevail. Next slide, please. And as ITIF has written across a series of reports, the way in which China has elected to compete in the global economy, largely characterized by innovation and mercantilism, has had significant impacts on the ability of a number of industries to compete on innovation-based terms. So we wrote a series of reports over the past year looking at the impact of Chinese mercantilism on 5 sectors, including semiconductors, high-speed rail, networking equipment, biotechnology, and solar photovoltaic cells. And essentially what we find that many of Chinese practices, subsidizing companies, supporting overcapacity, disrupts the economics of innovation-based industries, because these industries fundamentally depend upon the profits earned from one generation of innovation to finance investment in the next. So if they have to compete against global competitors that can earn non-market-based rates of return because they've been subsidized or because intellectual property has been stolen, this undermines the kind of quality, the environment of the competition in innovation-based industries, and is very detrimental to the global trading system. Next slide, please. And we have to recognize that some of China's unfair trade policies has had very detrimental effects on foreign trade partners. If you look, for instance, at the U.S. goods trade deficit with China from 2001, when China entered the WTO, to 2020, we find that China has accumulated a $6.8 trillion trade surplus with the United States over that period. And it's not just in low-value commodity goods, it's also in advanced technology products. From 2001 to 2020, China accumulated a $1.7 trillion trade surplus with the United States in 10 categories of the most advanced technology goods. Next slide, please. And this largesse has allowed China's foreign currency reserves to skyrocket from a mere $200 billion in 2000 to $4 trillion by 2015 and $3 trillion today. China, of course, uses this largesse to pursue a range of geopolitical and national security and economic goals, many of which are antithetical to American interest. Next slide, please. So how specifically does China fall short of its WTO commitments? Next slide, please. Well, as we write in False Promises 2, the continuing gap between China's WTO commitments and practices, it continues to fall short across a number of commitments in areas from joining the government procurement agreement, to curtailing subsidies, to notifying them timely, to eschewing the use of technology transfer or intellectual property theft as conditional market access. Next slide, please. But of all the issues where China falls short in its WTO commitments, we believe that the most fundamental one is China's rejection of the WTO's market orientation. Membership in the WTO is predicated on predominantly private enterprise-led, market-based, rules-governed trade in accordance with the fundamental tenets of national treatment, transparency, non-discrimination, and reciprocity. And if you go back to the report of the Working Party on China's accession to the WTO, China promised many of these things. That report notes, quote, "The government of China will not influence, directly or indirectly, commercial decisions on the part of state-owned or state-invested enterprises, including with regard to the quantity, value, or country of origin of any goods purchased or sold." It noted, all state-owned or state-invested enterprises would make purchases and sales based solely on commercial considerations. Yet today, under Article 19 of the Company Law, all Chinese state-owned enterprises or private companies actually have to have a Chinese CCCP cell, Chinese Communist Party cell attached to them, effectively codifying CCP influence over corporate governance. Next slide, please. And despite the promise that SOEs would come to control a smaller share of Chinese economy, that has also not been the case. Today, there are 150,000 Chinese SOEs accounting for 40% of industrial assets worth 15 trillion. A 2019 OECD report noted, quote, somewhat surprisingly, over the past decade, state assets doubled relative to GDP in competitive SOE industries. And the number of Chinese SOEs in Fortune's Global 500 actually tripled from 2008 to 2017. Next slide, please. Aggressive industrial subsidization has been a critical component of Chinese economic development strategy. According to Usha Haley, since China joined the WTO in 2001, subsidies have annually financed about 20% of China's manufacturing capacity. And an estimated 95% of Chinese firms and tech industries received R&D subsidies in 2015, with those subsidies accounting for nearly a quarter of those firms' R&D investments. Next slide, please. Perhaps no industry, apart from steel, has seen more aggressive subsidization than the semiconductor industry. China's National Integrated Circuit Plan, introduced in 2014, envisions $170 billion of government support to develop a fully closed-loop semiconductor ecosystem in China, with Chinese companies able to engage in all facets of the semiconductor production process, from R&D and design to fabrication to assembly, test, and packaging. When the OECD looked into the extent of global subsidies to the semiconductor industry from 2014 to 2018 across 21 companies, it found that 86% of the subsidies it could identify went to Chinese firms. They found, for instance, that state subsidies as a percentage of revenue for China's SMIC, its largest semiconductor manufacturer, were about 40% of the company's revenues over those 4 years, over 30% as well for Xinhua Unigroup and Huahong. And as the OECD writes, quote, there appears to be a direct connection between equity injections by Chinese central government and the construction of new Chinese fabs. And this helps explain why China has increased from just 1% of global semiconductor production in 2000 to an expected 24% share by 2030. But it also risks, of course, the potential for overcapacity in this industry and the ability for these firms to compete through subsidies without having to earn market-based rates of return. Next slide, please. Of course, it's not just semiconductors. Subsidies have been used across a wide variety of other Chinese industries. My colleague Rob Atkinson looked into the networking equipment industry, found that Huawei alone had received $75 billion in state support over 25 years, as well as enjoying a $100 billion line of export credit. In 3 years, from 2010 to 2012, Chinese solar photovoltaic industry received $42 billion in subsidies. And that was a key part of explaining how China went from virtually no production of solar panels in 2005 to controlling 60% of the global market in just 6 years by 2011. And then steel as well. The Chinese government provided over $50 billion in subsidies from 2001 to 2006 alone, explaining why just 2 Chinese steel producers now produce more steel than Japan and Korea combined. Next slide, please. You know, when China joined the WTO, The Economist breathlessly intoned, quote, thanks to the WTO, foreign firms are no longer required to hand over technology in exchange for entry to China's market. But China's practice of requiring the transfer of technology as a condition of market access, what they call trading technology for market, continues apace, as Thomas Hout and Pankaj Gamawat wrote in a wonderful report called China versus the World, Whose Technology Is It?, which documented the extensive use of forced tech transfer in a variety of sectors, from high-speed rail and autos to biotech and cloud computing. It's important to note that despite Chinese promises that these practices are starting to abate, they're actually not. A 2019 report by the European Chamber of Commerce, reported in the WSJ, found that more than twice as many European firms felt compelled to transfer their technology to Chinese partners in 2019 than in 2017. Next slide, please. As Jim Lewis of the Center for Strategic and International Studies writes, quote, China has operated long-running state espionage programs targeting Western firms and research centers. As the IP Commission report on the protection of U.S. intellectual property finds, as much as $600 billion in annual IP theft of U.S. IP, largely from China, may represent, quote, the greatest wealth transfer in history. This IP theft continues apace. Last year, CNBC reported that 20% of North American organizations reported having their IP stolen in China within the past year. It's not just the United States. In Europe, the EU Intellectual Property Office finds, quote, foreign IP infringement costs the EU over $70 billion annually, with China and Hong Kong, quote, the main offender. Again, China promised to curtail these instances of state-directed, state-sponsored IP theft, but they continue apace. Next slide, please. And lastly, China continues to close or restrict market access to US and other Western firms in direct contravention both to its original WTO agreement and into the covenants it's made with the United States and one-off agreements as part of like the strategic and economic dialogue over the past 20 years. Today, U.S. cloud services companies lose nearly $1 billion in possible revenues annually due to China's cloud services restrictions. Despite China's promise to open its banking market 20 years ago, at year-end 2020, foreign banks held just 1.4% of banking assets in China. And in the video industry, China committed to allowing 20 films to be imported annually and to permit joint ventures to operate cinemas and distribute videos. Neither of those things has happened to the extent China promised. Next slide, please. Okay, so if China is not meeting its WTO commitments still, what are we going to do about it? Next slide, please. So as ITIF wrote in a 2017 report called Stopping China's Mercantilism, a Doctrine of Constructive Alliance-Backed Confrontation, we really have 5 choices. First, we can wait for Beijing's conversion to the Washington Consensus, that China will ultimately come to recognize that the liberal international order of open markets is the preferable one and just come around to our point of view. We don't think that's going to happen. We can harangue and implore. If we continue to hold long-running dialogues like the strategic and economic dialogue, maybe we can one day get them to kind of come around to our point of view. We can engage in resigned defeat, just accept the reality of the situation and say there's absolutely nothing we can do about it and just accept it. We can choose a course of global isolation to try to largely decouple and disengage the US from China and other international markets. We don't think any of those first 4 solutions are the right one. And in that report, we call for this doctrine of constructive alliance-backed confrontation, where we work with like-minded nations to collectively push back against China's unfair trading practices and insist that China meet the commitments it signed up to in joining the WTO. Next slide, please. So in the report, we offer a number of policy recommendations. Now, certainly we agree with colleagues like Andrew and Daniel, and I'm sure Clete, that the very first thing the United States should do is to bring more cases against China at the WTO. And as Andre writes in his wonderful book with great research, he notes that China has been a defendant in 44 WTO cases. 6 of those cases have been settled or terminated, while 12 are still in consultation. Of the remaining 26 cases, 21 have been adjudicated while 5 are pending. And of the 21 cases that have been adjudicated before the WTO's Dispute Settlement Board, China has lost every single one. So there's good evidence that when we bring good cases at the WTO against China's unfair practices, we can win. We should certainly pursue that strategy. The problem with it, though, is that it's a whack-a-mole approach. We identify one problem, we knock it down, a problem appears elsewhere. The problems we face in China's engagement in the WTO are more systemic. And that's why Jennifer Hillman of the Council for Foreign Relations writes, quote, "Fundamental reform is required if China is to remain a member in good standing at the WTO." And that's why she and us and others have suggested that perhaps it is time that the United States pursue a non-violation nullification and impairment case against China at the WTO. The WTO includes a non-violation clause that provides a legal cause of action against measures that do not explicitly violate the treaty, but nevertheless upset the reasonable expectations of the parties, and which can be aimed at policies that might be otherwise beyond the reach of the GATT and WTO agreements. Such a non-violation nullification and impairment claim would assert that the United States and other like-minded nations are being denied the benefits of reasonably expected market access through China's behavior since they joined the WTO. As Jennifer Hillman writes, it is exactly for this type of situation that the non-violation nullification and impairment clause was drafted. Beyond that, one thing we should do is work more closely with our allies to publish a comprehensive bill of particulars against China. What we mean here is that the United States annually creates a report called the National Trade Estimate Barriers Report, where we catalog instances of unfair trade practices other countries around the world make. Of course, we have this with China. Europe has its own set of reports. We should sit down with like-minded countries and produce one single report cataloging and inventorying all the unfair trade practices predicated against like-minded nations by Chinese actors. And one thing we should do there is, if we are finding Chinese entities to regularly steal intellectual property or commit economic espionage against those allied companies from allied nations, we should deny those Chinese entities access to those markets. We should also insist that any Chinese companies that are accessing US financial systems provide books in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. We should continue the work of the Trilateral Trade Ministers Working Group, especially with regard to the subsidies reform work they're doing. In particular, we should update the WTO's rules to impose much stiffer conditions on and penalties for aggressive industrial subsidization. This should start by clarifying the definition of a public body, extending it to include state-influenced activities or entities such as SOEs and private firms. We should obligate the subsidizing country to prove that a given subsidy does not inflict harm on others. And WTO members should insist upon the timely and complete notification of subsidies and establish a presumption of prejudice towards any subsidies not timely notified. Lastly, we believe the United States should bring the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade and Pacific Partnership Agreement, and in doing so, bring South Korea and Taiwan along with us. Next slide, please. We also need to strengthen ourselves and our allies. Here, it is imperative that Congress pass the USICA, the United States Innovation and Competitiveness Act, which includes $120 billion in R&D funding over the next 4 years, $50 billion to support the semiconductor manufacturing industry in the US, investments to support our innovation ecosystem through university tech centers, regional tech hubs, etc. While certainly we need to confront China's unfair trade practices, it is imperative that we strengthen America's ability to compete in innovation-based industries. We should also help our allies in doing so. And we can do so, for instance, by passing the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, which calls on the US to develop a formal Indo-Pacific strategy to counter China, and would provide $100 billion to the Development Finance Corporation to invest with regional allies and like-minded countries in supply chain security, infrastructure development, and cybersecurity. So, in conclusion, a China that faithfully abides by the rules of the WTO is one that can produce win-win outcomes for itself and other nations in the global economy. But we must insist that China does so. And if it doesn't meet the full range of its WTO commitments, we need to continually aggressively push back against it. With that, next slide. Thank you very much. I want to remind the audience that we welcome your questions after our panel discussion. And with that, I'll turn the conversation over to Andrew. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to read the report and to comment. I will, as you mentioned at the start of this discussion, I will comment your very interesting report from the vantage point of the book on China and the WTO that Professor Mavroidis from Columbia Law School and myself published with the Princeton University Press a few months ago. So I will make 3 points. The first point is that I would say, Petros and I, we definitely agree that there are problems, even increasing problems, of compatibility between the WTO system and China's economic system. However, point number 2, however, we partially disagree on the nature of the compatibility problem that you present in the report. So we partially disagree, which means also that we partially agree, obviously. And third point, we therefore also partially agree and partially disagree on the solutions that you proposed in the report. So let me elaborate on point number 2 and point number 3, and let me begin with the nature of the problem that we are facing. I think we do need to recognize that integrating China into the world trading system was always going to be a huge challenge, I insist, huge challenge, because I think of 2 features of the Chinese economy. One is its size, the size that it had back in 2001, and certainly the potential size that it had and that it has partially realized already in the last 20 years. And the second feature certainly is the economic system. So let me elaborate a little bit on this, but let me also say right from the outset that it's precisely, I think, because of those features that makes China special, the size and the economic system, that I think that it was the right decision for China and for its partners that it joined the WTO back in 2001, that it joined a rules-based system in order to manage this huge potential challenge, some of which is indeed realized with the amount of clashes that we are seeing. First point, the issue of the size. Assume just for a second that China was not a socialist country, but a genuine market economy, or more or less a genuine market economy. Let's say a genuine market economy like Japan was a genuine market economy. Not only after it joined the GATT, but even back in the 1980s and 1990s, where there were many clashes with the US and with the European Union. So I think the Japan experience tells us that, irrespective of the economic system of China, there were going to be a lot of clashes because of the kind of integration that China chose, which is the Japan integration, sort of very fast growth in trade, and that way convergence and moving up the ladder of industrial specialization. Now, it is a fact that many of the criticisms that are leveled against China, including some that are in the report, are very much identical to those that were leveled at Japan, even up to the 1990s, including the issue of the trade surplus that Japan then enjoyed with the US and that China now enjoys with the US, including back then with Japan in IT products already. Now, I mean, I'm not going to go. I'm an economist. I'm not going to go over all the discussion. I'm not a big fan of looking at trade policy based on bilateral trade balances or even current account balances, and what is due to China, what was due to Japan, what is due to the US macroeconomic policy. But I think all the point that I wanted to make at this stage really is that some of the features and some of our displeasures with China are not unheard of compared to the Japan experience. And I think we should have been a little bit more alert to that. But then let me move indeed to, I think, to the central issue, the economic system. I think we all agree that China had made tremendous progress towards becoming a market economy from the point from where it started during the first decade after it joined the WTO. And I think this progress in moving towards a market economy is also partly what explains its huge trading system. Trading success is not just because it had market access, better market access, it's also because it was able to take the opportunity and therefore doing the reform internally that the WTO membership gave it. But I think we can also all agree that China has changed its strategy since 2012. I think there's no point entering, and there's no time here to discuss why there was the change in course, why China stopped making progress towards market economy, and why indeed the state and the Communist Party, as Stephen very well explained, have taken a bigger role than it did during the first decade after China joined the WTO. But the fact of the matter is that it is. So I think the problem of compatibility between China and the WTO is with the spirit, and maybe more with the spirit than with the letter. If you look in, what are China's commitments to the WTO, well, it has made the same commitment that every WTO member has. It has to respect the WTO agreements that were signed at the end of the Uruguay round, and then there is on top of that the protocol of accession that China signed when it entered the WTO. So those are the commitments, WTO agreements, plus those that are contained in the protocol of accession. Our assessment, the assessment by Petros and me, is that China has largely abided to its formal commitments and rulings, no less than other WTO members. It has been taken, and you Stephen, cited the numbers that we indicate in our book. The number of cases against China. China has lost all of the cases that have been adjudicated, but it's also true that China has abided by the decisions of the WTO judges. So, but the fact of the matter is that in some domains, and the most contentious ones, the commitments that China has taken are very, very vague. So when it comes to the spirit of the WTO, what we refer to as the implicit liberal understanding that underpins the WTO, as it didn't underpin the GATT before, this implicit liberal understanding, say what it means to be a market economy, that has never been translated into WTO rules. And so, in a sense, when China entered the WTO, it made the commitment to become and please note, a socialist market economy. We paid more attention to the notion of market economy. Maybe the Chinese paid more attention to the socialist part, and the socialist part is indeed the role of the state, if not the role of the party. And the fact of the matter is that there is no formal test in the WTO about what a market economy means. It's not like when countries enter into the European Union. Some of the Eastern European countries, when they entered, they had to pass a test in order to qualify as market economy and to qualify as members, and there was a process about that. That does not exist at the WTO. So I would say that for us, Petros and I, the problem of compatibility is due to a large extent to inexistent, in some areas, or insufficient WTO rules in a number of matters, in a number of domains that have become huge irritants, including those that you listed, Stephen, like forced technology transfer or subsidies by state-owned enterprises. So based on that, let me come to the issue of the recommendation, the options. And I see three options. The first option is the unilateral option. That was the option used by President Trump, and that to some extent is continuing with President Biden with phase one. I think that phase one has failed. Phase one has failed because, number one, it did not deliver the systemic changes in China, nor has it reduced the obsession of the Trump administration with the bilateral U.S.-China trade deficit. So, the bilateral trade deficit did not decrease, nor even the overall U.S. Trade deficit. So now I think discussions, I would say the Biden administration has moved from bilateral, unilateral U.S. Agreement on phase one with China to what I think you propose, and I think what the Biden administration has proposed to its allies, to like-minded countries, including Europe, that we should have a front, and it should not be pressure just from the US on China. It should be from the US together with its allies. So it's a variant of the unilateral approach. Option two that you discussed also, Stephen, is to litigate against China at the WTO based on existing WTO rules. We already discussed, the different cases that have been brought at the WTO against China and what happened there. But you then also repeated the proposal by Jennifer Hillman of using a non-violation case against China. And that could be brought by the US, could be brought by the US together with its allies, including the European Union. Now, in our book, we discuss that. And frankly, we dismiss it. We dismiss it not because non-violation cases are not possible under WTO rules. They're explicitly possible. But in fact, they are extremely difficult to bring successfully. And, one should recall, since I did mention Japan before, and displeasure of the US with Japan up to the 1990s, one should remember that the famous case of non-violation complaint that was in the record, that is in the record of the WTO, is a case brought by the US against Japan. The famous Japan film of, if you want, Kodak Fuji case. And the US lost the case. So, the track record of non-violation case is not really great. Nor, if you won the case, is there any assurance that China would change the policies in the areas that are the most irritant that you discuss. So we do not agree at all with Jennifer Hillman's viewpoint, which is, very, very widespread in Washington, but we believe it's partly misguided. So then there is option number three, and I will close with that. Option number three is WTO reforms in specific areas. Issues that relate to the forced technology transfer, the SOEs subsidies, and issues of transparency. You are very, very right that we do have a problem with China of notification. Now, this is not just a China problem, but when it comes to China, it turns into a huge problem. So yes, notification, transparency are a problem. Now, I conclude by saying, yes, sure, you could say, we are in favor of WTO reform, but, how to bring that about, how to convince China to sit with its WTO partners, including the US and the EU, and implement, and first agree on the reforms and then implement them. So in order to do that, I completely agree with you, Stephen, that the US joining CPTPP would be a good idea, if only because the CPTPP does have discipline, precisely the kind of discipline that we would like on SOEs, that we would like that be included in the WTO. And yes, I think it is a good idea that the United States coordinates better with like-minded countries, including the trilateral with the EU and Japan. So I think for all of those reasons, I believe that's still the best option, not the easy one, but the best option in order really to bring about the structural changes that we need is the multilateral option via WTO reform. And that means that all of us, including the US, with the appellate body issue, need to engage or re-engage with the WTO at a higher level and deal with the challenges, the difficult challenges. So let me now leave the floor to Daniel Crosby. Daniel.
Thanks a lot, Andre. I guess I'll start with kind of segue from your presentation, Andre, to say that I think the discord or kind of half disagreement between you and perhaps Professor Mavroidis with the ITIF paper shows that there's a lot of work that's left to be done on straightening out whatever facts we're relying on. But I guess the facts that I'm relying on establish two things. First, that the Chinese state party approach to managing trade is sui generis and not comparable to anything we've seen in the past. Up until perhaps the 2012 or a little bit thereafter, people were comparing it to other kind of state capitalist or kind of early Japanese models. But after that, when the party state took over really, and Chairman Xi started implementing his ideas on really managing all aspects of the economy, including by putting Communist Party cells in every single state-owned and private company in China, and controlling private enterprise through cross ownership and through those party cells. I think that's really changed the picture for me, and so I'm going to present based on those facts. And I guess I'll start with next slide. A couple of observations which seem quite obvious, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page here, that in order to maintain stability of trade relations, any agreement governing international trade has to reflect agreed principles that lead to outcomes that are considered fair and mutually beneficial. Now, that's an obvious point, but I'm not sure it's reflected in current relations at the WTO with China. Secondly, if the parties' commitment to implementing the agreed principles changes, the form and constellation, meaning the membership of the agreement, also has to change to track these realities. And I think the main issue here is that China did agree that the state and party would not intervene directly in trade under existing rules since 1947, affecting the private sector, and under the very specific rules in state trading enterprise language in the existing agreements and in the specific SOE disciplines that China signed up for, wouldn't intervene in the economy, 40% of which is state-owned enterprise, and the rest is private, whatever that means in China. That's also controlled by the government, influenced by the government. Next slide. So just to think about the very basics, the market orientation, which Andre says is just kind of implied, and I'll go into a little bit more why I think the kind of market, meaning non-state intervention, is explicit in the basics of the rules. So the WTO agreements have to be governed by market principles because governments agree that within the established framework of rules, that the invisible hand of the market will direct outcomes in trade. And this requires that governments agree not to intervene in all aspects of trade. Next slide, please. So this is the very essence of WTO WTO rules. That we all know that China signed up for MFN, and any government that intervenes in favor or against a WTO member uh, violates the MFN principle. And this means that when you have the phase one agreement that Andre mentioned as ineffective, what it shows though is that China has the capability of instructing its businesses to buy goods from the United States, meaning MFN violation against all other WTO members in favor of the United States. So China can do that and does do that. The other element of that is trade coercion, when China instructs its companies not to buy Australian goods because they mentioned something about COVID or health or origins of disease, or any other of the many examples of coercion, which are straight up MFN violations, which just show the government's possibility and actual implementation of measures that violate the basic core of the WTO agreements. So secondly, any government intervention that accords less favorable treatment to foreign products in favor of their own products violates national treatment. So we have on the record something called a dual circulation policy in China, which is imposed self-sufficiency by the state and Communist Party through Communist Party representatives on every business in China, that they have to buy Chinese products to show that the Chinese are going to produce and then consume within China, meaning that's the dual circulation. So those issues for me are the direct violations of MFN and national treatment, which come about through the state party system right there, which directly violate the paragraphs mentioned by Stephen and Andre in the protocol on accession, that the government of China would not influence directly or indirectly commercial decisions of state-owned enterprises. The fact that that only refers to state-owned enterprises supports the point that the entire WTO agreements and GATT before it apply to non-state-owned enterprises as well as private sector. So the private sector is not mentioned here because the rules already apply. The governments may not intervene in private sector decision making. And since SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are particularly susceptible to influence by governments because they're owned and controlled by them, we have specific rules on those. But really, those rules apply to the 100% of the businesses in China. So the important part here is that in order to maintain trust that WTO members are competing on a level playing field, since 1947, another basic rule is that we have to publish all measures affecting trade. So trust in the neutral application of the market and letting the market operate is essential for the trading system to operate at all. And transparency is essential to maintaining that trust, because no government will accept economic losses where another government gains by distorting outcomes by having its thumb on the trade scale, which is what China's doing. If members don't trust that others are allowing the market to work freely because of overt intervention or by unpublished measures or political instructions to Communist Party cells and all companies regarding trade outcomes, the system will be perceived to be unfair, it will break down, and dysfunction will set in. So as part of China's accession, in addition to the usual commitments, we've already heard that there's this paragraph 46, and I would just say that no one believes that the Chinese government is not influencing decisions on SOEs, and there's an entire body of academic literature and empirical study on these points that establishes that the government and party are directly influencing the outcomes of decisions on what companies buy and sell and to whom internationally and within China. Next slide, please. So in this sense, in place of the invisible hand, that is supposed to determine outcomes under WTO rules, the socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics is managed with what I call the invisible thumb on the scale, directing economic outcomes in favor of perceived Chinese interests by the Chinese Communist Party and the government. No one who's read the academic literature and empirical studies on China over the past couple of years believes that the state party allows the market to determine outcomes, except when the party determines that a hybrid market can play a controlled efficiency role. And no one believes that China is publishing all measures that affect trade. So the thumb on the scale remains invisible for most important measures. However, increasingly, Chairman Xi is not dissembling on policy anymore. He's very clear on the record that China is offering an alternative political economic system that he considers to be superior to existing Western capitalism and market-based economies, including, I would say, the WTO system. So in recent years, China has intensified a program called Grand Steerage by Professor Barry Naughton, and many others have supported this view that structural intervention into all aspects of economic life, including state-owned, state-invested, private businesses, again, whatever private means if you're kind of cross-owned by the government and influenced by Communist Party cells, when most firms are state-invested anyway, and they influence all aspects of business, what they buy and what they sell in trade. So this understanding of the facts and their implications is beginning to emerge in Geneva, but we have a long way to go because you have a lot of people opining about these things in some way, like Andre did, which are operating on a different set of facts. And so we need to make sure that we're all operating on the same page here. Next slide. So the WTO systemic interface issues with China are just one of many WTO dysfunctions that need to be resolved. And assuming China continues down its current path, and a very recent path, of party state total intervention in trade, beyond the kind of do nothing route, my perception is we have only two structural options. The first is to develop a new system to accommodate China's hybrid approach within the WTO, but based on a non-MFN managed trade approach to address China's non-market system. Secondly, the B option is to establish a separate trading system completely for countries that remain committed to market orientation of trade relations and adjust WTO rules accordingly. So all members of the WTO, I'll kind of wrap up here by saying that all members of the WTO really benefit from trade with China in some way. But the accommodation of China within the market-oriented framework of the existing multilateral trading system will continue to produce dysfunction. So the only option is to develop an alternative framework that will facilitate balanced trade relations with China in light of the political economic system that it has chosen for itself. And I'll stop here in conclusion. And most importantly, members must decide whether to pursue trade based on basic market principles driven by the invisible hand, or based on the invisible thumb under a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. And with that, I will turn to Cleet, who will make practical and political sense of all of this. Thanks.
I'll do my best. I do appreciate the chance to weigh in on this topic. I'm batting cleanup, so I will try to be somewhat brief so we can get into the back and forth and really discuss a lot of these things in greater depth. But as Daniel indicated, what I will try to do is to give this a little bit more of a political lens from the U.S. perspective. And there is a phrase, I think, that has become almost cliche in Washington, something we started saying in the Trump administration, and really is what I would describe at this point as conventional wisdom. And that's that when China joined the WTO, we believed that it would become more market-oriented, more like us. It would smoothly integrate into the system. And we were wrong. And they actually have moved very rapidly in the opposite direction, starting somewhat in 2006, 2007, and then really accelerating under Xi Jinping. And so the view is, therefore, we need to do something different than we've been doing for all of these years to try to address concerns about China's rise and the implications that has for the global economy. Now, there's another piece of, I don't want to call it conventional wisdom yet, in part because I disagree with it, but a statement that now sort of closely follows that first statement. And that's this notion that you hear that one of the biggest mistakes that the U.S. has made in recent years is allowing China to join the WTO. This is something that you hear increasingly in Washington circles. And you don't just hear it from the folks that you might suspect, from the union-oriented Democrat or the national security-oriented Republican. This is something I've heard some of the people you might think of as quintessential free traders saying in recent weeks and months. I've heard this kind of commentary from Kevin Brady. I've heard it from Paul Ryan, who I used to work for. And it really shows that it is becoming close to being your Washington consensus. I want to unpack that issue just for 1 second, because I do think it's worth exploring. And we don't have the counterfactual if what would have happened if China didn't join the WTO. But I think we all need to remember that even if China wasn't in the WTO, we had been applying MFN duty rates to them for a number of years. It's unlikely that would have changed at any point in time prior to the Trump administration, where it has, for all intents and purposes, changed with the Section 301 tariffs. So again, a lot of other countries were in the same situation. So that probably wouldn't have been all that different. I don't think anyone thinks that if China wasn't in the WTO, Xi Jinping wouldn't have suggested Made in China 2025. So I'm not sure how that would have changed that situation one way or another. And I also don't think you would have a situation where this growing economy with billions of people wouldn't have been an attractive place to invest. And so I think, this notion that having China join the WTO was this fundamental mistake that changed everything, I think kind of misses the picture, in my opinion. Now, I do think you could argue there are certainly elements to WTO membership that have made a difference, and it sort of gives a country an imprimatur of a positive investment climate, and that clearly brought more people in than otherwise would have. And I think there are some specific WTO disputes where China was able to successfully challenge tools that the U.S. and others used, especially the public body dispute. That wouldn't have happened if China wasn't in the WTO. But those are sort of incremental on the margins kind of things, in my opinion. And I think there's just this fundamental problem. So that brings me to, what fundamentally went wrong and what has gone wrong in the last few years. And first, clearly it's impossible not to lay some of the blame at China's feet, right? I think, as the first couple of speakers have indicated, China is really intervening in its economy in a very deliberate, very expansive fashion, and that has been a problem for global trade. So clearly, no one here wants to let China off the hook. I think they probably have done quite a few of the things they said they would do when they were joining the WTO. There's a lot that they haven't done, but it's clearly, you got to look at China first. Then you look at the U.S. and you say, where were we in all of this? And really the common refrain you hear in Washington is that, the Bush administration wasn't aggressive enough. They should have utilized the safeguard mechanism under Section 421. They should have brought more WTO disputes. And maybe there's some truth to that, but, they were focused on other things. Quite frankly, we had the Doha round, we had the war on terrorism. We had China just joining the WTO. And I don't think we immediately realized that they weren't going to continue on the trajectory that they were on around the turn of the century. The Obama administration, which I was a part of in a non-political sense, I was a lawyer at USTR, they picked up on this, I think, pretty clearly by the second term, and were moving in this direction. And I think you could argue maybe they didn't move fast enough, they weren't aggressive enough. But, again, this was a dawning realization that happened to us in the U.S. And then the Trump administration, of course, was laser focused on this issue, was very aggressive. And I think the critique that you sort of hear implicitly from basically everyone today is that they should have dealt with this in more of a multilateral, coordinated fashion with allies than they did. So again, you can blame the U.S. in many respects, but I also think something that isn't talked about enough, and this will get into sort of my recommendations and my reflection on the various recommendations that have been made, is the fault with the WTO itself. And I think maybe we have overvalued the ability of the WTO to deal with the problems with China, both in the past and prospectively. And I think, you look at the WTO, this is an organization that we can look at it today and say it isn't effectively constraining China. It doesn't have all the right rules in place. And we need to create new rules. But are we really going to be able to do that in any sort of realistic time frame? I mean, we haven't been able to get a fishery subsidies agreement in 20 years. And we're going to come up with all these rules that deal with the biggest problems confronting China. I think that's far-fetched, quite frankly. It pains me to say it, but I think it's far-fetched. And I do think that, as Daniel points out, there is this incompatibility as well with the system. And we have to recognize that. And then you look at the dispute settlement function, which takes a long time and in many respects has been reluctant to call China out on some of its practices. And so, I'm not totally optimistic that the WTO can do this. I'm not saying turn away from it, but I think we really need to look at something like DATO. I guess it was the democracy, or what, I don't remember, Stephen, what you called it, but I do think we need to look at other ways to work with allies outside the WTO to leverage change. I think that realistically, that's probably the only way we can get the level of discipline that we need. Let me make some concluding remarks, and we'll go to questions. First, in terms of a comprehensive strategy, I just want to touch on something I outlined. I testified before Ways and Means about a week and a half ago on a China strategy, and a lot of what I said was consistent with what Stephen recommended. So I just want to sort of introduce this framework for thinking about some of the things he said, which is, number one, we need to run faster in the United States to outcompete China, and that includes things like USICA and a lot of other measures. Number two, we need better defense. We do need to be looking at what are the appropriate types of trade remedies, what are the appropriate type of trade investment restrictions, what are the appropriate type of export controls and things like that. They need to be well coordinated with allies to be effective, but I think we need to look at those things. And then there's offense, which includes bilateral engagement with China. It includes plurilateral agreements like the TPP, which we should be a member of. And then it includes what are we going to do multilaterally. And I will say, given my skepticism about the WTO, I do think you need a strategy outside of the WTO where you look to create a high discipline organization. I'm not saying totally give up on the WTO. I think we continue to go there, to give it the college try, to do our best to try to get results. But I think we need to be realistic. And perhaps by showing that we're willing to go in this other direction, we create enough pressure for change from within. So let me stop there. Hopefully those were some helpful political remarks and some commentary on the recommendations, and look forward to the questions.
Well, thank you, Andre, Cleet, and Daniel, for those excellent comments. Really appreciate it. I'm mindful that Andre has to leave imminently in just a couple of minutes here. So, Andre, just wanted to invite you, if you'd like to respond to anything that you heard from your fellow panelists, or any closing remarks you'd like to provide before you have to go.
Look, I should say that I enjoyed the remarks. I think that there would be an interesting discussion to be had where I able to to stay longer. I just want to take Cleet's last point. I like the very last sentence. I was worried about the one sentence before. So I think, this issue, which I've started to hear also in Brussels, alternative institution, things of that sort. Right? That the WTO as we know it, either it has to change, or something else has to change. We with the US and others, we have to think of some alternative institution. No, that worries me. I mean, as I said, the last sentence, which is, to use that as a pressure, as a strategy. I like that because I like that because you're still preserving the goal, which is to maintain the institution. And the point that I tried to make, I think that was really the main point that I tried to make, is that incorporating China into the system is a huge endeavor. It was always going to be a huge endeavor. Maybe we were too naive, when we can look, they cheated, we were naive. I mean, God knows what it is. But I think it is a huge problem. At the same time, there's no alternative to my view. It's, when you're facing a huge issue, you just sort of don't walk out of the place, of the tent where you can potentially solve those issues by building a new tent. I just don't believe in that. I believe in trying to, hard to make some progress. And so, as I say, one is tactics to bring the different actors, including China, to the table. And I'm all with you on that. The other is to really, contemplate leaving the tent altogether and creating a new one. And I'm not too sure that there will be many countries that will follow the US onto this. If I look at the latest summit on democracy, I can't say it was a huge success from that viewpoint, from the viewpoint of a coalition to achieve this kind of thing. I'm very sorry that I have to leave. I have another meeting, similar discussion, not at all on the same topic.
Everyone's doing China 20-year anniversary events. It seems like this weekend last. So
I really enjoyed it. Bye.
Thank you so much, Andre. Appreciate it.
Stephen, can I jump in just to clarify some elements?
Of course,
yeah. Look, and let me say, first of all, I come to this position, with a heavy heart, so to speak. I mean, look, I've written voluminous reports on the importance of the WTO and how to reform it, and ultimately that is the gold standard. That's what we want. But I think we have to be realistic, and I think we have to look at what's happening at the WTO right now, and recognize we can barely agree on anything. And so to think that given the system we have, the configuration of members we have, that we're truly going to deal with these massive problems, I don't think it's realistic at this point in time. And I'm clear, I'm not saying the US should leave the WTO. I'm not saying the US should stop engaging at the WTO. I think the WTO is an incredibly valuable institution. It will be an incredibly valuable institution moving forward, but it is a limited institution. And that is something that has become increasingly clear in recent years. And so I think we keep the WTO as it is, and then we try to figure out, is there something that we can build on top of this? And hopefully over time, this secondary parallel universe becomes bigger and bigger, and we can reintegrate them. But I think, just thinking that we're going to go and we're going to do a industrial subsidies proposal with the EU and Japan and the WTO, and it's going to solve our problems, I just don't see it.
You seem to be aligned with Daniel broadly on that point of view.
Well, he didn't take a position. I will say, Daniel, jump in, because you in your paper, I thought you outlined this incredibly well and saying here's basically our two options. But what do we do at this point?
Yeah. So I actually think that when I present these things and try to talk about it, I'm trying to bring people along to the debate that facts have to be gathered and opinions have to be respected until everybody understands all the facts and can do the analysis together. So I've reached my conclusions, and I tried to be clear on that in my presentation today, that China, we all want to have a benefit of trading with China at some level. And the problem is we've promised to tie our hands and not, Trump, of course, got around that, and I applaud that. But that violates the rules and violates the rules against our friends and trading partners. And I wish, instead of dropping those kind of 301 tariffs, that we would convince all of our allies to impose their own and react the same way we did. The fundamental incompatibility is, I think, what we need to address. And Clete, to your point of not changing anything at the WTO, I actually think that wouldn't work either, because the MFN rates are so low that that other group won't have a very kind of effective margin of preference in trading with each other unless we not change the rules, just use the rules to renegotiate, put MFN rates up higher, and do a kind of FTA type approach with everybody else in the ideal world. But I think we can't let China have a non-market approach, or even a hybrid approach, which means 80% non-market and 20% private, or whatever that is, that we'll never figure out because they're not transparent about it. So we just can't deal with the system that's meant to be invisible hand. And if they always have their thumb on the scale, the Communist Party sitting there, determining the outcomes, then we just can't allow them to distort trade. And if you're a politician, you're watching your workers lose their jobs because you agree to let China do this, and not being sure at all that you're getting a fair shake in China, because the Chinese government and party are determining how much American stuff to buy. So I just don't think it's ever going to work. I'm very pessimistic, and I think we have to go forward with a different way. And if we don't, it's at our own peril.
Clete, to that point, I understand that the Biden administration is currently undertaking a so-called TTB top-to-bottom review of U.S. trade and economic policy towards China. USTR Catherine Tai has made some speeches laying out some elements of what might be the Biden administration's approach. Can you shed any light on perhaps how you see the Biden administration's evaluation of U.S. China trade and economic policy evolving?
Sure. And let me start with the good, right? And I do think that this administration deserves a lot of credit for maintaining a tough line on China. I think there was a perception by some, internationally in particular, that President Biden would come into office and roll things back, and we'd kind of go back to business as usual. That hasn't happened, and I give them credit for that. I think they do clearly recognize the challenge that China poses to the global trading system. So that's good. I also think they have a much more structured way of decision making. They are very focused on working with allies, from a high level perspective. And I do think, Daniel, I agree with you. I mean, I think you're 100% right on how we should have done the 301. I would have done the 232s the same way. I argued for that and I lost. But look, I do think that their focus on China has been consistent with where the Trump administration was. I think the structures have been sound. And I think the emphasis on working with allies has been sound. That said, I think the major critique here has been that there hasn't been a lot of substance, behind this high level framework, and there hasn't been a lot of willingness to engage in what I would call an offensive trade agenda. I outlined in my testimony and my remarks today sort of the three-part strategy, which is the running faster at home. They've been focused on that. Sort of the defensive measures, they've been somewhat focused on that. There needs to be an offensive agenda. And that offensive agenda requires real trade agreements with real trading partners around the world. And I think it's, look, we could talk about CPTPP for hours, but I do think it's a shame that they aren't willing to entertain those kinds of substantive ideas where you're actually changing laws, regulations, trade rules with your allies. And with China flirting with the CPTPP, I think that it's more critical than ever that they do that. I also, they're talking about this Indo-Pacific economic framework, which I think has some virtue to it as a complement to an actual trade agreement. And, they're talking about coordination on things like export controls and standard setting, things that we don't traditionally use and do in trade agreements. I think that's great. We should be doing it, but it is not a substitute for something like CPTPP. And then when you go to the WTO, look, I want to give, soon to be Ambassador Pagan, some time to get into her position and move forward. I think she's fantastic. She used to be my boss when I was at USTR. I have nothing but wonderful things to say about her, but I really hope that she comes out of the gates here and does have a robust sort of negotiating strategy at the WTO, because that's also been a deficiency. And it was a deficiency in the Trump administration too. People in Geneva may totally disagree with the statement, but for what it's worth, the U.S. did a great job of creating leverage to deal with the appellate body and to deal with some of these issues. And then they never really put forward a complete vision that others were able to latch onto. And I hope this administration improves upon that. I will say so far, hard to say what their vision really is. But again, I want to give Maria, time. And so I don't want to jump to conclusions. And sorry, Stephen. Well, I should just touch on the phase one deal. Look, I mean, what Catherine, or Ambassador Tai also said was that, they were going to maintain the phase one deal as sort of the baseline for engagement with China. I think that's appropriate. I think, look, phase one wasn't the greatest thing in the world, and it wasn't the worst thing in the world either. I mean, people have polarizing views on it. The bottom line is we made some incremental structural, we got China to make some incremental structural commitments. We didn't get nearly everything we wanted, and we got to keep at it. And I hope that they will. I'm not sure how much energy they're going to put into that. I think they're going to focus on enforcement in the next 3 to 6 months. They're going to focus on what do they think the appropriate tariff mix is in the next 3 to 6 months. And then we'll have more clarity moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Clete. Want to take a couple questions from the audience, and I'll read them off. If you see them as well, Clete and Daniel here, maybe feel free to respond to either or both. But first question was, quote, the U.S.-China decoupling process seems to be characterized by a number of asymmetries across trade and finance. Is finance out of sync with trade? One possible question to discuss. Second, isn't the responsibility of this situation relying also on U.S. and European companies that continue to do business in China, including even moving their R&D to China, and the private capital, private enterprise, private equity capital investment that continues to occur in China? Welcome. Any thoughts on those questions?
You want to go first, Clete?
Oh, sure. I don't want to consume all the oxygen, but yeah, no, I'll take a quick shot at it. The finance question. Look, let me say this is a tough one, but the trend lines in the U.S. are unmistakable in the sense that policymakers are very focused now on financial investment in China and are considering a number of mechanisms to potentially crack down on that. You did have the Chinese military industrial companies list where Americans are prohibited from investing in certain companies that are linked to the Chinese military. My perception is that as long as you sort of do your due diligence in putting the companies on the list, that makes some sense, right? We don't want Americans funding China's military. I think that's pretty straightforward. Where it gets more complicated, I think, are some of these ideas. Well, let me start with another one that I think makes sense, right? Which is, Chinese companies being on U.S. markets. Look, they got to play by the same rules as everyone else, right? If they're not going to allow access to their audits, that's a problem. We can't let that happen. That's a question of sort of the sanctity of our markets and their reputation. So those things make a lot of sense. Where it gets tricky, and I'll be honest, I don't really know that I've gotten my head around what's appropriate and what's not, is these notions of these outbound investment screens and other things where people are increasingly saying, you know what, semiconductors are critical to U.S. National security, therefore no American should invest in China's semiconductor sector. That's a big step. That's something we've never done before. It's something that I think in many respects, deprives American companies of the ability to benefit from China's growing market. It deprives pensioners of returns. So there's a lot of questions we got to answer there, and make sure we do it in a very narrowly scoped way that's focused on national security issues. But that is a conversation right now going on in Washington that I think is going to yield some policy making. I will just say it's something I'm trying to get my head around. If we do something like that, I think we need to be narrowly scoped. We need to tie it to national security, and we need to coordinate it with allies. But let me stop there on the finance question, and Daniel, you can comment on that or the other one.
So first on the financing question itself, it's embedded in a question of the decoupling process. I don't think there is a decoupling process. I don't think there was. I don't think there is a recoupling process right now. I just think there's a rebalancing of systems, and I think the old GATT practice always showed us that when a socialist country wanted to join a market-based system, you did it on the basis of managed trade and quotas. Every country did that. All the Eastern Bloc, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, everyone who wanted to joined the GATT, but not on an MFN basis. So this whole kind of caging China into a managed trade situation under phase one, for me, is perfect. That's what the system should be structured to do. If China chooses to have a non-market based economy to some extent, our response should be, we'll manage trade back at you in our own interest. It doesn't mean because we revoke MFN that we're going to have huge tariffs on everything. It means we choose like they choose. And that's how you manage a bilateral relationship when one of the parties is not a market economy. So on finance, the kind of just to add a point there, when Cleet said we've never done that before, but again, looking back to the kind of pre-90 or the fall of the Soviet Union, we always did that. We always told businesses where they can invest and where they can trade with and what they should or shouldn't do. So I don't think we're there yet. That's the kind of answer to the second question. Is this really the kind of blame on private businesses? If the government doesn't restrict what private business can do, they're going to go do whatever they want to and go make money where it's legal for them to do so. So until we get to the point where we think that China's really crossed the red lines of geopolitical kind of military situation, that companies are still going to go invest, and as long as it's legal, they're going to do so. I would think that a lot of companies kind of look at labor costs and all kinds of political and other risks and maybe choose not to go there. I don't expect everyone to operate out of patriotism, but I think that some should and some do. But that's not what business is all about. Corporations are supposed to go out and raise money do I think there should be restrictions? Absolutely. And some of the sectors that Cleet mentioned, and I also think that this untangling of the Chinese economic system, where you have cross ownership and shell companies of the government and Communist Party owning and controlling private sector, we have to have, like we ask for clarity in listing in New York, we should also have clarity on investment in China, that they really don't have ownership or control of the Communist Party or military or anything like that. And that would help to open up the transparency of a lot of these kind of dystopian issues that are going on over there.
Yeah, and let me just really quickly comment on this, because I largely agree, so I won't belabor it. But I do think, look, I mean, without clear guidance from the government, one should not expect U.S. and EU companies to pull out of China. That's not our model, right? I mean, that is not how we operate, and they are chasing profits. So they should be. This is a massive growing market. And if you look at the phase one deal, this was actually about us doing more business in China. The real issue here is just on what terms is it done, and then how can the U.S. government interface in order to ensure that it's done on terms that are not unfair to our businesses. We need to be a shield for our businesses. We need to give them clear guidance on what they should do. And if there are sectors where we don't want them investing, we need to make that clear to them and have that conversation. So again, I don't blame U.S. business. I don't blame European business. But maybe there's a broader conversation to be had about where and where not.
Well, and I'll just add that the reality is that our companies do need to be in China. If you look at the semiconductor industry, 36% of their global sales are in China, and they depend upon those revenues to reinvest in future generations of R&D and innovation and the tremendous capex requirements of the industry. So, this is why we need to arrange those economic relationships within the framework of the WTO, right? Which is
but Stephen, this is a great point, because what you are talking about here is a conversation I have with my national security friends all the time, where I say we want to be selling it to China because that means China is subsidizing our innovation in the United States, right? We want Chinese money going to our companies so that they can continue to innovate and stay ahead of China. And so it's I'm not a decoupler. But you need to have clear guardrails around where there need to be guardrails, and you need to let companies do business where they should be able to do business.
Yeah. There's also the point that every dollar of sales that a U.S. company earns in China is a dollar of sales that a Chinese company doesn't earn in China. And that's important for our companies and those of like-minded nations as well, right? Especially if China's going to have a protected market where these companies are shielded from competition so they can achieve scale and then go out and compete more effectively in third-party markets, in our view. Well, hey, we got one more question from the audience. Maybe we'll just wrap the conversation up with this one. Essentially, the question is, Cleet and Daniel appear to lean towards Daniel's door number 2 to establish this kind of new trading system approach. If that's what we do, kind of this alternative framework that y'all talked about, Cleet and Daniel, what should be the buy-ins and next step in this direction? How would we actually start down the road of making that happen?
Yeah, so I'll take that one first. So I actually think that although I think all paths are going to lead in that direction, it's actually both. Like we need to maintain the WTO, stay active there, as Cleet was saying, but there's no way you can do that based on the current system of MFN. It's just, that's not, unless you totally renegotiate all market access and figure that out. But really, it's with the main offender. There's no reason to kind of ditch that whole system. So we need to figure out how to restructure the WTO to make sure that it's the systemic interface accommodates the huge non-market hybrid percent that China's dealing with, while also going outside of that to create not only pressure, as Andre was saying, but a real way forward for countries that really want to trade and really share the same principles. As I started my presentation by saying, it has to be based on principles. And if it's not based on shared principles, it's going to implode at some point. So we really need to get back to a system that's the one that's moving forward the fastest, is based on shared values and shared principles that are real. I would say the way forward, though, is my last bullet that I had in my presentation. There was the discussion of architecture, but first of all, facts. Why are we doing this? And make sure we all understand that it's not that we don't like China. I mean, maybe some people don't like China, but that's not what their systems match. Can we do this at all as a matter of principle and economics? Is it going to work? Does one puzzle piece fit in the other? In this case, they don't. And so what are the architectural options? And the place to discuss that is in WTO reform. And although the ministerial conference didn't happen now, the ministerial declaration had a couple of paragraphs, one where members were committing to start a discussion on WTO reform and dispute settlement reform. As part of that, going into next year, that there should be an actual discussion of those things. And I hope, even if we don't have a ministerial conference with all ministers physically present in a room, that members will move ahead anyway. And I believe they will start that discussion about WTO reform, dispute settlement reform, including, how are we going to deal with this kind of reckoning that one of the biggest trading countries in the world doesn't accept and actually holds out a separate and new kind of approach to economics and interaction.
So I'll just quickly jump in and say, look, I think fundamentally we agree that it really is not simply a door number 2, but it's a 2-part strategy, and that there needs to be robust WTO engagement, and then there needs to be robust engagement on trade outside the WTO. And I emphasize that word trade there because, in my opinion, that is what the Biden administration needs to do next, which is to make clear to our partners and allies that we're actually willing to negotiate trade agreements, instead of simply frameworks and technology councils and things like that. And again, I'm not saying those things aren't valuable, but they are not a new trading system. They're nowhere near that. And so we have to show a willingness to actually internationally engage on trade issues, in addition to willing to internationally engage on standard setting and export controls and things like that. And that's what they need to do. And again, I will give them a little time at the WTO because, again, they don't have an ambassador yet. Hopefully when she gets there, they hit the ground running. But then I think they also need to figure out how to ramp it up on international trade in and of itself.
Well, that's excellent. I think we should probably leave the conversation there, but I want to thank you, Cleet, Daniel, and Andre for being with us today, for your excellent interventions and remarks. I want to thank the audience for being with us Lastly, I want to note that video of this event will be posted on ITIF's event webpage by the end of the day today, so feel free to forward or share with colleagues. And with that, I look forward to the opportunity to discuss with you China's 25th year in the WTO, 5 years hence. Thank you, everybody. I know these conversations will continue, and we'll see you in 2022. Thank you all.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.